have already got it.
Sorry
Many of you
about that.
guys, all good, have already met our wonderful school counselor, Mrs. Reinhold, and we're so happy to have her. And we're also really happy to welcome Dr. Bloom. Just a little bit about Dr. Bloom. She is a licensed psychologist here in Orlando and a pediatric neuropsychologist who provides assessments and therapy and consultation services. We are so happy to have her come from, her background is receiving her BA from Emory University and Masters of Education and doctoral from University of Georgia. And while at UGA, she conducted clinical research on the neurobiological basis of dyslexia and ADHD. And so we are really thrilled. Dr. Bloom has works with students with dyslexia, ADHD, and all the other related things, and really helps parents to get the right resources. So we are thrilled to have her share with us today about anxiety and executive functioning for kids in those younger ages. And then in March, we will also have a second one for kids and students who are a little bit older than that. So without further ado, Dr. Bloom, welcome, and glad to have you.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. Thank you, Brittany. I really appreciate you guys having me, and I'm thrilled to be here. And we're going to have a good time today talking about anxiety and executive functioning. I think there's someone out there who doesn't have their mute on. I could be wrong, but I'm just hearing a little bit of background noise. So please let me know if you have any questions throughout. I know that Brittany is going to be monitoring the chat, and I'm hoping we'll also have plenty of time at the end for questions, so that we can, do some problem solving. Let me see. Oh, okay, that worked. So we're going to talk a little bit today about brain development. Being a neuropsychologist, I always have to think about it in that context. We're going to talk about what executive functioning is. So if you don't know, don't worry. We're going to be talking about what that is. We're going to talk about anxiety. And then we're going to talk about how you might go about teaching emotional regulation and executive functioning to your kids. And then family strategies, things that really help build these skills as a family. All right. So there's a lot of brain development that is happening in the first 5 years of life. Just so you know, about 95% of brain development is done at the age of 5. But if you think about the difference between a 5-year-old and an adult, you realize that that last 10% is pretty important, right? So that's really the development of executive functioning. And what's important to know is that children are not just little adults. Okay, they are, and sometimes we think that they are, and sometimes they are certainly capable of acting like it in one or more domains, but they're really missing the critical skills of executive functioning. And if you think about what executive functioning is, a very simple way of thinking about it is, what are things that adults can do that you don't expect children to do? So things like, you don't expect a 5-year-old to remember their water bottle when you're leaving the park. They are probably just going to walk right into the car without it. Remembering things, being organized, going through routines, figuring out if something isn't working and shifting from one thing to another, getting started on a project. Those are executive functions that you think about it, things that kids can't do that adults can do. And some of us, can do it better than others. We all have our moments, especially if we haven't gotten good sleep, that executive functioning is not as strong as it could be, even in us adults. It's the lowest hanging fruit neurologically, meaning if you're not doing well, then that is the most likely thing to be impaired. Executive functions also include emotional and behavioral regulation, meaning it being able to handle your own emotions and your own behaviors and make appropriate choices and responses. So instead of just automatically reacting, thinking before you react. Another thing to know about these ages, because we're generally talking elementary school kids here. Kids, by 5th grade, things are starting to shift. And some kids, 4th, 5th grade, some kids are really hitting more. That's why we developed this whole tween category, right? But some kids at the age of 9 or 10 are really thinking more like teenagers, and some of them are thinking more like younger children. There's a lot of variability. So one thing that you want to think about kids this age, though, is they still think very, very concretely. So for example, if you said to a kid, if you needed a medicine in order to save someone's life, but you couldn't buy it and you had to steal it, would that be an okay thing to do or not? And when you start to think more abstractly, you realize that there's two sins being committed, two crimes being committed. One is the stealing, but the other one would be letting someone die who doesn't have to die. So in that case, kids who are this age will say, no, it's wrong to steal no matter what. There's no exceptions. And once kids hit about 12 or 13, they start to realize that things are a little bit more complicated and that there's more complicated situations. Kids are also very concerned with what's real in front of them rather than abstract concepts. And so it's very hard for them to do things like think about all the things that they do before they have to leave for school. They're very much just focused on what is right in front of them rather than planning, organizing their behavior. And parents often overestimate the ability of kids this age to make good decisions, especially if those kids are bright and verbal. We often think that bright and verbal correlates to, the verbal IQ kind of correlates to overall functioning, but no matter how smart your kid is, at that age, they're still not fully capable of making good decisions, even if they can articulate things to you. And even though they make connections and you're really impressed with their vocabulary and their skills, they still don't have those executive functionings. Those are just not online yet. And it surprises people a lot to know that brain development continues until 25 to 27 years of age. So you're not done. Even by the time you graduate high school, your brain is not done developing. I had a friend recently whose kid was making some big decisions for her life at the age of 23. And we were talking about, I said, well, I explained about the adolescent brain, and she said, but she's 23. I said, but her brain is still not done. So, you do have to think about it. Okay, see if I'm having trouble. There we go. Okay. So the great thing about this age is this is like a nice period of quiet before puberty hits. So you've gotten through the toddler years where they don't necessarily have a lot of reason and things are changing so fast in their brains and they have lots of meltdowns. And in this period, it's kind of quiet. There's no gigantic leaps that are being made, no big changes in terms of, okay, you can think this way, but not this other way. But everything kind of gradually increases in complexity. So like, for example, their strength and their ability to participate in complex motor skills increases. So that's why they're able to do more sports. When you think about like 4 or 5 year olds out on the soccer field, they're barely doing very much, right? But by the time they get to 6, 7, 8, 9, you're seeing a lot more complex motor skills. Same with language. Language gets a lot more complex and kids are capable of being a lot more independent. You probably wouldn't leave a 2 or 3 year old alone in a room, but you very well might leave a 6 or 7 year old alone in a room, knowing that they generally understand safety rules, things like that. However, peer relationships are becoming a bit more complex. We've moved from I'll play with anybody who's in front of me, which is one of my favorite reasons that I love pre-K. Pre-K, they generally, everybody is their friend and they will play with anybody who's in front of them. But, by 2nd, 3rd grade, they're starting to not feel comfortable with brand new kids. And they're starting to form real friendships where they really have to be comfortable with a person in order to play with them. And so they tend to feel the most comfortable with the kids that they spend a lot of time with. However, lucky for us, parents are still the primary attachment at this age. And also kids become a lot more reasonable around 7. It doesn't do a lot of good to negotiate or to rationalize behaviors to kids before then. But around 7, you can start to explain things like consequences and the reason that you're making these decisions, and they really can understand better. All right. So executive functions are brain functions that are used to manage your attention. I would say also control your impulses, manage your emotions, and control goal-seeking behavior. Like I need to turn in my homework tomorrow. Therefore, I'm going to do it today and put it in the folder and bring it to school and pull it out of the folder and give it to my teacher. It's a lot of steps. And a lot of those steps don't have anything to do with the content of the homework, but more getting it turned in. So those executive functions really start to emerge during the preschool years, but they don't fully mature until adulthood. But what's really important to know is how important they are, because they are more predictive of your success in life and your school success than your IQ is. Parents are often so concerned with what is my child's intelligence, but I would venture to say I am more concerned about the executive functions, because that is often going to be what you need in order to truly be successful. So again, here's just a nice graphic that tells you a little bit about what executive functions are. And of course, one of the hallmarks of ADHD is poor executive functioning. But there are a lot of reasons, including development, that your kid can struggle with any of these things. Okay, so they're really important for school readiness. We do see them in the preschool years. And it's more important to predict how you're going to do in kindergarten or first grade than your academic skills going in and your IQ. It's more predictive. And if you think about it, you really do need to have like control of your impulses to get through school, because you have to be able to handle your emotions and your behavior. You have to manage your distractions. You're trying to learn something. You're having to manage, just an incredible amount of things in order to get through school, including the distractions around you, other things that could, what other kids are doing. And you need to be able to use those executive functions. It's a lot of in math and reading. And we know that overall, poor executive functions can lead to problems in life. So executive functions are really, really critical for your academic achievement, but also your social and your psychological development. So this is talking about ADHD, and we're not talking about ADHD today, but there's so many reasons that you can have difficulties with executive functions. And Russell Barkley, who's an amazing ADHD researcher and speaker, says that what happens is that ADHD cuts the brain in half. And I want you to think about this as any kid with poor executive functions. Back here, you have knowledge of what you're supposed to do, but executive functions are being able to actually do it. So the difference between knowledge and performance is really what executive functions do. And there's all these wonderful connections from the back of the brain down here and through here, all the way through the center of the brain up to the frontal lobes, which is where the executive functions are held. So this is the area of the brain that controls executive functioning, but there's huge fiber bands that connect them. And so if you don't have strong executive functioning, you have a lot of difficulty showing your knowledge. So you might completely understand that social studies concept, and you might be able, but you can't answer questions about it on a test because you get distracted, or sometimes by what's in your environment, but also sometimes what's on the page. So that's the difference between the two. This is this poor kid being tortured, right? So this is a great example of how executive functions are measured. And this is a very famous experiment that was done at Stanford in the 1950s and then was repeated, I think, in the early 2000s with a better sample. And it's called the marshmallow experiment. And what the marshmallow experiment is that you took a kid into like a little testing room with a two-way mirror, and you said, oh, here's a marshmallow, and we're going to do something, and then you're going to get the marshmallow as a reward. All right. And then the researcher pretended to be interrupted and said, oh, hold on. I'm so sorry. I've got to go for just a second, but I'll tell you what, if you don't eat this marshmallow while I'm gone, when I come back, I'll give you two. And so that's the question is, could they control the impulse to eat the marshmallow? And it was the marshmallow experiment. And what they did at Stanford in the 50s is they found that the longer you could go without eating the marshmallow, the more that actually predicted lifetime success. So they followed those kids for a generation, and they found that how long you could go without eating the marshmallow, inhibiting your impulsive response really showed a lot about what was going to happen to you academically, health-wise, even success in your marriage. So the executive functions are really important for that. And this particular one is controlling your natural impulse, which is, of course, is to eat the marshmallow. Most kids can't do this, by the way, just so you know, most of them cannot. So that self-regulation and emotional stability often account for over twice as much variance in the final grade as does IQ, even in college. To be able to stick with stuff, even when it's difficult, and control your impulses really accounts for a lot of success in life. Okay, hold on. I'm going to move this over so I can read my own slides. All right, so executive functioning and mental health. Children with less self-control have worse health, earn less, and even commit more crimes as adults 30 years later. Now, anxiety, ADHD, autism, depression are often associated with impaired executive functions. And that's why I'm talking about anxiety and executive functions together, because as we will see, when you have a very state of high anxiety, it turns off the frontal lobe of your brain. So this is just an example of how things develop. I just think this is really interesting. They did, the purple is typically developing kids, and the blue is ADHD. So part of the goal of this particular study was to see that kids with ADHD do tend to be behind in their frontal lobe development. And the frontal lobe is where executive functions happen. But it's also really good to look at the normal, typically developing control subjects, and seeing that, so they're all in the purple, and seeing that at the age of 7, there's not a lot going on in terms of frontal lobe development. It's very hard. And even through the age of 13, you've got it, but it's very, very light. There's a lot more frontal lobe development that needs to be happening. So kids our age, kids the age that we're talking about today, 4 to 9, roughly, they do not have a lot of frontal lobe development that has already happened. And therefore, it is really important to understand that and to not expect them to behave in a way like that. Okay, so we're going to talk about anxiety. Anxiety is the #1 most common, form of diagnosis, psychological diagnosis. They happen a lot with ADHD. With ADHD, they tend to be because you have ADHD first and you don't get it treated, and then you start having all sorts of problems in your life, and that leads to more anxiety. Untreated anxiety can also lead to depression or eating disorders, but often the anxiety is core, and it's what came first. And it is somewhat genetic, meaning that if you have a parent who's prone to anxiety, you're somewhat prone to it as well. And that occurs across adoption studies. So it's not just like what the parent's modeling, it's also the genetics of it. So if you have anxiety and it's not treated, you're at higher risk to perform poorly in school, have friend difficulties, and engage in substance abuse. So almost every case of severe substance abuse has anxiety at its core, because the substances that we tend to abuse, alcohol, for example, alcohol is a very powerful anxiolytic. It reduces your anxiety. And so a lot of these drugs do that. A lot of drugs in general will reduce your anxiety. And that is the reason. So it's often the anxiety that leads people to substance abuse. So without treating the anxiety, you're not going to be able to successfully treat the substance abuse. And when you develop it in adolescence, you have a higher risk in adulthood. And for this age group, it's important to know that untreated anxiety in first grade has been shown to predict anxiety and low academic achievement in reading and math in 5th grade. So these kids get into bad cycles where they worry about stuff. And because they're worrying about stuff, they're not paying as much attention, because anxiety can impair your attention. And because of that, they end up having lower performance in reading and math. Okay, so I wanted to show this. This is about post-traumatic stress, which is not our topic here. This slide is, but at a lower level, the same thing happens with general anxiety, which is that this area right here, the red, that's the amygdala. That's our fight or flight center right there. So that's when you have a lion chasing after you. This is where the alarm bell is set. And what this area does when it's been reacted is it inhibits. So when this is high, this red area is high, it directly inhibits the frontal lobe, and it directly inhibits the hippocampus, which is the memory center. So when you have a state of panic or fight or flight, things going off in your brain all the time, you're going to get lower executive functioning and lower learning and memory. So the point of this slide is really to show that the fear brain is a different brain than the learning brain, and the two cannot be active at the same time. So managing your fears, managing your anxiety is really important to being able to be in a state where you can benefit from the education that you're being given. Okay. Yeah, the reason I want to show this slide was just to say that things got really bad in about 2020. I'm sure everybody remembers. It was a very, very stressful time. And we hit a point where adults, about 41%, were experiencing symptoms, like significant symptoms of anxiety or depression. This was measured in the fall of 2020. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because if you were experiencing some anxiety or depression during that time period, you were not alone, but also you are all parents, right? We're all parents, and our anxiety and depression does impact our kids as well. So all of our kids have experienced in some degree, due to the pandemic and the lockdowns and so on and so forth, a traumatic event. And so it's something that can be worked through and you can get through, but everybody is a little bit more at risk than they would have been without that, if that makes sense. Okay, so this is pre-pandemic. There were alarm bells being sent out in psychology circles saying we have an epidemic of anxiety. This is pre-pandemic. So that's when it was about 12.5% of children, about a quarter of teens. Okay, it moved up to about 22% of kids in the fall of 2020. But there was new data that's come out, and this is measuring something a little bit different, but it was an incredibly high. It was 57% of teen girls in 2021 said that they report feeling persistently sad or hopeless, which is depression, which often comes after anxiety, and 29% of teen boys. So the rate of mental health disorders in kids, and particularly teenagers, has skyrocketed. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk to a group of parents your age is because we can do some prevention now. And if they are experiencing anxiety and symptoms of anxiety and depression now, I really encourage you to get some help before those teenage years hit and everything gets harder. And just so you know how bad things are, because things are pretty bad, unfortunately, for kids right now. There is hope, though. So what we have seen, though, is that, yes, it did shoot up after COVID, but longitudinally since the 1950s, we've been seeing like it's just been creeping up, and it's about 5 to 8 times what it was in the 1950s, depending on how you ask the question. And at the same time, we've seen a decline in empathy and a rise in narcissism. So this is some longitudinal studies where they've been asking the same question since the 1950s. So we've been seeing a lot of changes in mental health. And this is one theory. I think that it's too simple to say that there's any one cause. I think there's an awful lot of causes that are going around. But one theory is that there's been a major decline in play. And play is so important. Because it develops their social skills, it develops executive functioning, and it develops emotional regulation. It often also occurs with exercise and outdoors, which is great to keep your body healthy. We don't have a lot of unstructured play for our kids. And when I say play, I don't mean playing with Legos at home. I mean unstructured play with other kids. Like this is about the 1950s in Ireland, kids playing ball in the street, right? So the unstructured play where no adult is telling you this is your job, you have to use your executive functions to work it out. Okay, we're playing soccer. Who's playing this? Where are the goals? You have to work it out with other peers, and it's fun. So you persist in it, and you have to use those executive functioning skills. So unstructured time for play is incredibly important for the development of social skills, executive functioning skills, and emotional regulation. So, but play is not so much always respected in our society. I think sometimes we feel like it's a waste of time. We're so busy. We have such busy schedule. I'm a parent too. I have a 10-year-old and a 13-year-old. I understand. And it's really hard for me to make sure my kids have their time for unstructured play, but it's a priority for my family. Maybe we would be more respected if we called it self-motivated practice of life skills. So you have to realize that this is how kids develop. And they develop, one of the great things about play is that whenever they're playing, they're kind of advancing their physical and their mental abilities. So they naturally do that in a fun way during play. So if you guys get a chance, Peter Gray is the researcher here. He has books, he has TED Talks, and it's really, really interesting, and it'll help you think about play in a really different kind of way. Okay, some strategies. So I wanted to show this because I wanted you to see that the emotion center, how it can shut down some of that prefrontal cortex, because they don't get along with each other. So if you have your emotional system is too high, that executive functioning area will turn off. So what are some of our strategies for treating anxiety? And we'll talk about how to build executive functioning too. So one of them is to make sure that there's time for play. Solitary play is good. Unstructured play with other kids is even better. Play with parents is fine, although as parents, we tend to not be able to resist teaching something during that time. And that's not the purpose of play. The purpose of play is to have them figure it out. In general, I think it's really important for parents to also talk about emotions that they're experiencing in a non-judgmental way and talk about your coping strategies. So over the dinner table, you might say, I had a really stressful experience today. Such and such happened, and it made me feel really worried and upset. And so on the way home, I took a bunch of deep breaths in my car and I listened to some soothing music, and now I feel better. You have just taught your kid that it's normal to have these feelings in response to stressful events, and that it's normal to take charge of it and take control of it. Meditation and prayer are very useful in terms of being able to activate the frontal lobes. That's what they actually do. And that's wonderful. Being outdoor exercise is also useful for treating anxiety. And then this is, if things are just really kind of low key, a little bit of worry that you've got going on at home, this is a nice workbook that you can buy and kind of work through with your child. And then this is another alternative. It's a program called Go Zen. It's designed for 5 to 15-year-olds, and it actually teaches cognitive behavioral strategies, specifically for anxiety, through some really cheesy videos. So you really have to see if your kid responds to it at all. This was done like 15 years ago when animation was really bad, but the concepts are really good. And I've used this in my own practice in treating anxiety and had a lot of success with it. And then therapists are really, really great in terms of teaching coping strategies, emotional awareness, and they really can turn things around. One thing I said to a therapist friend of mine talking about the childhood mental health crisis is I said, this is so terrible. And she said, yes, it is. She said, but the good news is that maybe we're treating, because it's come up so big, maybe we're treating anxiety much earlier in development. And so if you can get a kid when they're 8 or 9 and get them to get control of their anxiety, they're not saying they might not need a tune-up at stressful times in their life, but in general, you can set them on a different trajectory. And so maybe they won't be so anxious, because we know that in general, early intervention really, really works and is effective. Okay. Okay, so I wanted to show you guys this. I don't know if Mrs. Reinhold knows this one. Do you know the feelings wheel? Okay, so of course you do. So one thing that's important to know is that being able to describe your emotions is the first step in terms of being able to work on your emotions. And the average number of emotions that an American adult can name is 4. And we have all of these. So one thing that's really great to do in general is to, when you're reading a book, when you're watching a TV show, pause and say, what do you think that character is feeling? And try to get a better emotional vocabulary. That's often where I start in therapy. I don't know about you, Mrs. Reinhold, you too, just emotional awareness. What are the feelings? That can prevent a lot of problems, just being able to express yourself. Okay. All right, some of the other strategies. So unstructured play, we talked about. Sleep is really key. It's impossible for, I mean, so the brain is growing during sleep. That's when the waste products are being cleared away from your brain and new structures are being put down. And so without adequate sleep, you really can't grow your brain well. I'm sure you've heard many times kids really need that structure and routine. It makes them feel safe. There's more and more evidence about the role of nutrition. I'm sorry to say, we all wish that we could just get away with mac and cheese and chicken nuggets. And you can, of course, do some of that. And of course, I do some of that. I'm just saying that there's evidence that what happens in the gut directly impacts the brain. So you have this microbiome, all of these bacteria that are living in your gut, and they actually will send neurotransmitters to your brain. Your neurotransmitters are made in your gut. So in some sense, your food choices are really important. And some of the bacteria that live on fiber send happy chemicals to your brain. And the bacteria that live on sugar and dyes and processed foods do not send happy chemicals to your brain. I wish the research were going in a different direction, but that seems to be the reality of it. Having dinner as a family is a really important tool. This has been shown in research study after research study that having that family time is really, really critical. I will say as my own family, that's where a lot of the social stresses, this kid did this, how should I handle it? That's a lot of where it comes up. Another thing is chores as part, believe it or not, at this age, it is a really great thing for your kid to participate in chores. Also not great news for us as parents because we could do it ourselves so much faster. But there is an age of initiation for chores, and that is from 3 to 7. Just when they're really bad at it is when they're interested in doing it. But if you can get them to do things, and you have to teach them, and I will say we went through a whole set of IKEA dishes. Like we bought a set of dishes from IKEA and they were sacrificed to the washing dishes and emptying dishwasher in a very rough way. They were sacrificed to that. But in the end, I haven't emptied the dishwasher in like a year. My 13-year-old is the one that does it. And then having that connection time is really, really important. Research shows that kids really only need about 15 minutes of connection on a daily basis. They benefit from that, but not distracted connection, like real connection, not looking at your phone, not teaching, not even asking them any questions. This is like playing a game with them, doing something with them that is really kind of that they initiate. That's where that connection happens. And so much of discipline comes through connection. So that is a really important part of it. Doesn't take that much time. And the reason I put the slide back up, I had a good reason for it. It was because the connection is really what drives that building of that executive functioning. So we're going to talk a little bit about, it's on this slide. So here we go. So I'm just going to skip to the last one. Collaborative problem solving is an approach that has been advocated by Dr. Ross Greene, who wrote a great book called The Explosive Child. Now, if your child is explosive, I certainly recommend the book. However, even if your child is not explosive, and if your child is explosive, even if your child is not, it is really fantastic to read some of his strategies because he takes the approach that kids who are behaviorally dysregulated have executive dysfunction, kind of like as if they had a learning disability in executive function. And so he says, let's build their executive functioning. And so he's developed this strategy called collaborative problem solving, which is amazing for building executive function. And basically it goes like this. It's very non-judgmental. It's, I've noticed, and this is a great, by the way, this works with coworkers, spouses, whatever. It's a great strategy. I've noticed that you're having a hard time getting your homework done. What's up? And then you have to be quiet and listen to what your child says. And sometimes the child, if you have a good relationship with you, if you have good connection with them, then they will say to you, yeah, I just really can't stand the writing, or I can't read the questions, or I'm just really hungry. So I remember at one point, my son brought home some really bad grades and I was upset, and I took deep breaths and I said, so I've noticed that you brought home some bad grades. What's up? And he said, I'm just rushing through all of my tests because I am so hungry. I just want to leave. And that was useful information. So I talked with his teacher, and he had unlimited snacks in the afternoon. He was in a growth spurt. He was eating a ton. So you'd be surprised by what you can do with this more collaborative problem solving approach. And, your kid might say, well, I don't care that I'm not getting my homework done. And then you say your point of view. My point of view is it's really important to me that you meet the goals that your teachers have set for you. So I want us to figure out together a way that we can do this. And can they solve every problem? Of course not. They're children, but at least they're part of the process. And that helps build executive functioning skills. And if they come up with a solution, they're more likely to follow that solution than if you impose a solution. So, so when you have something that happens, like very negative, you want to validate and reflect their feelings. I can tell that made you really frustrated. You want to not have big emotional reactions to what they are saying, because you want them to feel reflected and validated. And then you can do some collaborative problem solving. But most important is you want them to keep talking to you, because when they're teenagers, it's going to be vitally important that they keep talking to you. And they're only going to keep talking to you if they know that they can trust you to not get super emotional in reaction to them having done something wrong. Does that make sense? We'll talk more about that. But the external structures and routines, this is helpful. This is getting you out of being the nag. So when they're really little, you have things more like this. Okay, so you let them know. And then in the morning, that is what has to get done. And then you can just say to them, okay, check your chart. The chart is the boss and not you, and you avoid some power struggles. And then my husband actually just found this one. This is what my daughter did when she was about first grade, because now we're breaking down, how do you brush your teeth? Okay, so when they're in preschool, you're brushing their teeth. But at some point, they have to take ownership of that task, and it actually has a bunch of steps. And so how do you break down their teeth? And just my particular daughter likes to draw things out, write things out herself. Okay, not everybody does that, and you don't have to do that, but that's how she likes to process what she has to do. Okay, the last two slides are what I'm talking about. We talked about parenting tips, and I'm going to talk about what I call anti-parenting tips. Just to hopefully get everybody to relax and realize that kids are kids, and most of the time they're pretty resilient. Children are messy, impatient, and loud. This is not a disorder. This is how children are. They don't have executive functions. Have appropriate expectations. Much of what I often see is people not having appropriate expectations of their kids based on age. And really try to think about, is it appropriate for me to expect them to be able to do this independently? Okay, one thing that's great, teachers know what's age appropriate, because for years and years, they've had 20 kids in their class that are the same age. So they know what's expected and they know what's appropriate. Okay, expect your children to make mistakes. Expect your children to make mistakes that will embarrass you. And when that happens, know that that is not a reflection on your parenting. It is kids experimenting and growing and learning. And what matters is not that they made the mistake, but what matters is what you do from this point forward. Okay, so take a deep breath yourself, reflect feelings, ask compassionate questions, and then say, what do you think you should do to solve this problem? And then you can talk about things that might be appropriate. And allow kids to experience failures and learn the lessons, because that will stick with them much more than if you impose some sort of consequence or come in and rescue them. This is about parenting. I could do a whole other talk on the different types of parents and, the carpenter, the lawnmower, the helicopter. But the general idea that I love is the gardener parent, which is that, remember, your child is like a seed, and you don't really control what kind of plant they are. They might be a watermelon or they might be a tree. You don't know what they're going to be. All you can do is give them good soil and water and fertilizer and sunlight, and they will be who they are, and sit back and enjoy watching them be who they are, which might be completely different than you are, completely different than your spouse. You don't know. The other thing is, really not everything needs to be educational. You don't need to be doing the apps on your phone, teaching the ABCs. They are actually better off doing unstructured play. Most teaching doesn't happen through direct instruction. Most teaching is through example and observation. I saw someone who's a developmental psychologist say that she brought her kid to a baby class where the teacher was actually like moving a ball in front of these babies' faces to teach them to track. You do not need to teach that kind of thing. Kids will pick that most everything up on their own. You don't need to directly teach. They're very good at learning through observation, and they're actually worse at learning through direct instruction. Boredom is good. Boredom is a good thing. See what happens when they're bored. Not that you can't give them a little structure, some choices, but it's good for kids to experience that frustration of boredom and then to solve that problem for themselves. Same with some social conflict and negative emotions. We can't protect our kids from everything. They do need support in those moments, validation, reflection, some collaborative problem solving, but it's a part of life. There's no way you're going to get your kid through their childhood and adolescence without some social conflict and negative emotions. This one is for the moms. You are welcome to play with your kids, but there were whole generations where nobody played with their kids, and that is okay. They engage their kids in cooking or chores or gardening or other things that they were actually doing. Playing with their kids is wonderful, but it's not something mandated of parents. Some connection is mandated, but it doesn't have to be in the form of play. And you are entitled to have, a life and schedule that don't revolve 100% around the needs of your kids. It's good for kids to be dragged to the grocery store. It's good for them to be dragged to Costco. And that's an opportunity to build those executive functions of, I don't want to be here. I would rather be running around. Okay, so let's figure out a way to make this work for you. Can you hold the list? Can you look out for this? Can you take 10 deep breaths? Whatever it is you have to get through. These are some of my absolute favorite books. The How to Talk So Kids Will Listen is really great in terms of that validating, and it really does work in terms of getting your kids to talk to you regularly and ask for help when they need. So when do you need more help? If your kid does not want to go to school, if they're having persistent social problems, if their grades are going down. So some meltdowns are normal, especially through the preschool years. But if you get to be like first grade or so, and there's daily meltdowns, you probably want to seek out some help. Or if you're just having real trouble in one or more areas of life, in general, the earlier you get help, the less you will need, and you can kind of do a course correction. So please think about it in a positive way. We're doing a course correction here. We need a little bit of support, as opposed to feeling any sense of shame or embarrassment about seeking out professional help at a child's young age. And you have wonderful school resources there. You have clergy. There's also, if you're concerned, if you don't know exactly what is going on, a psych or neuropsych evaluation with someone like me can be helpful to determine, is it anxiety or is it ADHD or is it a learning problem? But if you know that it's anxiety, and your school staff can really help support with that in terms of when it's appropriate. You can work with a therapist, a psychologist. And in rare cases, I don't think most kids need medicine, but there are some kids who do need medicine young, and the psychiatrist can help. There are a bunch of different types of therapy. Play therapy is great, but it's really for dealing with more traumatic situations. So if you've had divorce or the loss of a loved one, play therapy can be really helpful, but it's not so helpful for anxiety. For anxiety and behavior, cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, and just plain behavioral therapy are the treatments that work. And that's all. Thank you guys so much for listening. I feel like I went through a lot of material very quickly, so I hope
Thank you so much. Yeah, we have are we ready for our Q&A, you think? Because we have one question. I have one question for you already.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So our first question, and you guys, if you have any questions, you can either unmute yourself if you want to, or you can post it in the chat. Our first question is how to deal when they show anxiety through eating nails or having fingers in their mouth. Do you have an idea about that?
Oh yeah. So that is one symptom of anxiety, but it doesn't mean that there's a lot of kids who just do that. It doesn't mean they have an anxiety disorder. Okay, so just to start with that, certainly you can see so I would see, is this part of a larger problem? If it's a larger problem and the kid's really having a huge amount of anxiety in general, and this is just one symptom of that, then that is something that you can certainly seek out professional help for. However, I feel like in most cases, it's just kind of a bad habit. There's a Berenstain Bears book called The Bad Habit about the fingernails. You know that one? Yeah. And it's pretty good. I would say in general, you want to give a replacement behavior. So fidgets are great. I think that, pretty much every typically developing kid that I know needs a fidget, and certainly any not neurotypical kid really needs a fidget. And then the other thing I would say is try increasing exercise and making sure that there's enough sleep, and see if because it could just be like a little bit of hyperactivity. They need to move a little bit. So kids need an astounding amount of exercise. During elementary school, they need 1 to 2 hours a day until puberty hits. That's a lot. So making sure they're getting enough exercise, doing a replacement behavior, try the Berenstain Bears book. I did get to the point with one of my kids where we did have to do the stuff on the nails. We had done all those other things, reinforced the other behavior, but we did have to get to the putting the gross stuff on the nails. And that worked, but I still see nails creeping back into mouth sometimes. Some people just do this throughout adulthood even. So, the thing that concerns me as a parent, having a kid who puts their nails in their mouth, is getting sick. That's the reason I really want to kind of eliminate that behavior. But there are those, the pop toys that the kids really love right now. They make bracelets of those. And when kids get a little bit older, they make some fidget rings. And those can be a really good replacement behavior. Also, when they're really young, I'm not above putting a dum-dum lollipop in their mouth. If for example, watching TV after dinner, that is a time when my kid will be more likely to put their hands in their mouth. So I don't have a problem to eliminate that behavior temporarily, to put a lollipop in her mouth, to be like, okay, there's something else in your mouth, just a little one, so that takes her a long time to eat. Does that make sense? What else?
Juliana, I'll ask, there's more and more places in the community that have like social skills type groups. And I know sometimes there's like, well, trying to figure out if your child would like need that level of support or not. Do you have any recommendations about, like, I don't know, I guess sometimes parents are, we have trouble like figuring out where the line is or how big the problem is type thing. I mean, here we use Social Bridges as a proactive social skills curriculum that Mrs. Reinhold does in the classroom. And I know they do like the clinical setting. There's also, different social skills groups around the community. Could you give your 2 cents about that? If that's just like a good practice or really where the need is?
So I definitely think that can be helpful. There's a couple known disorders where social skills tend to be a problem, particularly autism and ADHD. The research shows that but doing them as a blanket for everybody, building pro-social skills is really, really important. It's definitely important. I do think it's good to take opportunities to do that. Unstructured play does a lot of that social skills. And I would say also reading books to your child and talking about what's happening in the books. What is the character feeling? Do you think that the character responded the right way? that's a great way to kind of build up some of those, social thoughtfulness, if that makes sense. But yes, Social Bridges is a fantastic program. But there's a lot of things that we can do at home as parents to also kind of improve our social skills. If social skills are a major problem, you probably want to get that evaluated, in terms of, is it because of ADHD? Is it because of autism? Is it just because of anxiety? If it's not getting better with some of those normal kind of parenting and teacher tips. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I think sometimes it's like, we try and do, so much proactively here, but there's always like that, kind of gray area that, just thinking about how structured to make it, or how to, outside of TCS, like if a child really was needing, just to keep practicing those skills in a, maybe more clinical setting, and, different opportunities for that. So, yeah, I think that's great. I think you had a question here, which is probably, tricky to answer, but, about mentioning about meds and your 2 cents on meds. So,
Okay, my 2 cents on meds is that meds, I would certainly want to do anything I could to try everything before meds for kids, because we have developing bodies and brains. The one exception to that would be meds for ADHD. And the reason I say that is because there's, for a number of things, ADHD is probably one of the most highly genetic disorders that there is. And it's got an 89% concordance rate in identical twins, which is unbelievable. I mean, there's no, and we understand more about the genetics, the neurobiology of ADHD. It's a very simple pathway and very different than anxiety and depression. So we understand exactly genetically what happens in ADHD. We understand how that relates to frontal lobe function, particularly the uptake. It's a little the uptake and reuptake of dopamine in the frontal lobes. And the medicines work directly on that with very little else happening. So in terms of it, it is almost like, it's more similar to being like, well, if your kid had type 1 diabetes, would you not give them insulin in terms of the meds for ADHD? I will admit, as a field, we've got a lot of work to do on anxiety and depression in kids, and particularly medicine and disruptive behavior. We are not there to where I would recommend meds for kids. The medication versus therapy for anxiety, we do about the same. Medication versus therapy for ADHD, there is no comparison. So you can get about a 20 to 30% improvement in functioning with ADHD in if you do behavioral therapy. If you do medication, you have 55% chance of complete normalization of function and improvement to maybe being subclinical in up to 90% of cases. So it's a home run, and it prevents problems. That's the other thing, is that untreated ADHD leads to academic problems, social problems, anxiety, depression. And then, like, if there's a really hyperactive, impulsive component to it, like some pretty significant stuff, car accidents, addiction, not going on to college, a lot of major problematic behaviors, teenage pregnancy, all strongly related to untreated ADHD. Whereas if you do the medication, you can actually, starting at a young age, you can actually change the development of the brain so that those frontal lobes put on more layers. And in many cases, normalize brain function if you do the medication through childhood and adolescence. Not every function, not every kid. Some people will continue to need medicine, but not everyone. Okay, so then Ms. Sample put up, I understand you say anxiety is a precursor to ADHD. No, so ADHD is a precursor to anxiety. So you do have to get the diagnosis correct. You have to know which one came first and which one you want to treat. But if you have ADHD and that is not treated, eventually you'll have academic and social problems that relate to that untreated ADHD, and that causes anxiety. So that's the case where when I worked in the children's hospital and we had some medical patients who had both, the psychiatrist was very clear that they wanted to treat the ADHD first and then see how much of that went away before treating the anxiety. Now, I will say in terms of if I've got a kid in my clinic who I'm evaluating, who I'm not sure if it's anxiety or ADHD, I will sometimes say, I'd like you to go and get some therapy because I know for a fact you have anxiety. And if after 6 months of anxiety treatment, the ADHD symptoms have not resolved, then we can look into doing a diagnosis at that point. But I don't like to diagnose ADHD, unless I'm 100% sure it's not caused by anxiety, because the symptoms can look alike. You do have to get the differential diagnosis correct.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay, so this next question is probably hard to answer, but how much parental playtime is too much? Well, you guys are good parents, that's for sure. We end up being her main playmates and she dictates a lot of what she do. So one thing that you have to remember in that is, of course, that does happen. You do want to try to seek out some unstructured large group play opportunities for her, which can be hard to come by. I understand as a parent. And then also maybe not completing letting her dictate the playtime, and also making sure that she has some time where she is bored and has to solve that problem for herself. So look, connection is great, and parental play is great, but you want her to develop those other skills too, if that makes sense. And she's not developing a lot of executive function or emotional regulation skills if she's bossing the play all the time. Okay, good.
well, it looks like that's kind of our time. I don't know if we have some flexibility on time. What do we think? What about you, Juliana?
I'm okay. I can go a few more minutes.
You're okay?
Folks have questions.
Okay, it looks like we've got one more question, and then it looks like it's from Julie. She says, I'm very okay with my kids being bored, but what is a good response as a parent to your child when they state that they're bored?
So we validate feelings and reflect back, say, oh gosh, yes, okay, you're bored. I know it's really hard to be bored, isn't it? Well, right now, mom is whatever, finishing a meeting, cooking dinner, whatever it is you're doing. So here are some choices. You can play with this, you can play with this, you can play with that, and see if they can get themselves going on that. If they can't, you can get them started on something. And I mean, if they're at a place where they really can't play by themselves for 5 minutes, you can get them started on a task and set a timer and say, this is how long I need you to play by yourself. And it might start off, depending on your child, with 5 minutes, 1 minute, 10 minutes, but you build up to it. Try to resist the urge to give them an interactive game. Look, video games are not, yes, I'm guessing play does not mean electronic devices. Yeah. So the electronic devices, and look, they really can build some good skills. I'm not completely against video games or anything like that. The concern is that they are designed in a way to keep the dopamine firing in your brain all the time. And that's great. They're fun. And they do build some reaction time skills and problem solving skills. Video games can. However, they don't build the skill of having to control your emotional response and problem solve in a real life situation. So, you could, if it's something where your kid really can't play by themselves, you can certainly say, hey, I want you to play by yourself for 10 minutes. And then you don't tell them this in advance, but you say, or whatever you feel like is the limit of how long they can play by themselves. And then once you've had some of that time, you can say, okay, it's all right for you to have some time on the iPad or on the video games or something like that. Yeah. So she said, I just hate saying, well, it's okay to be bored. And I feel like a broken record. Yeah. Validate. You can offer some suggestions. Look, depending how old they are, they might not be able to solve that problem for themselves. That's part of building executive functions. You're providing a bridge. You're being like, okay, this is how we get through these difficult situations. Here's some options. There's nothing wrong with providing options and letting your child choose in that situation. Any other questions?
I wanted to say a couple things. And Julie, thank you for asking that. I was thinking that it's a good response because I get that all the time. I'm bored. But you said so many great things, Juliana. Thank you so much. Took so many notes, and I'm going to print out an emotional wheel and start using that just so we can kind of get a little bit. That'd be good for me. And I wish I had a lot of these tools when I was young.
Me too.
Yeah. What's your thought on board games? Because I feel that's maybe somewhere that's structured play, but can that help with executive functioning? Like, coming up with some, they have to think about what they're going to do. What's your thought on board games?
Yeah, I mean, so structured play has its benefits. It's just unstructured play. We have to make sure we don't lose that entirely. But structured play absolutely has its benefits. And yeah, turn taking and reading social cues, and there's certain academic skills that can be taught through board games. Board games are fantastic. I think it's really great. And that's often because I don't really like to do the imaginative get on the floor kind of play. When my kids were younger, we did, and still even now, a lot of what we do together is board games because I can enjoy that more. Like, to be honest, like, I'm just not going to play little guys with you and wrestle. And that's just not me. That's not who I am. And I'm not going to fake who I am. And so the board games were good for me. And still at the age of 10, my daughter loves to play like Connect Four or some card games, So, and that games are something you can continue to do with your kids throughout their lifespan. So they're, you just get more complicated as they go. One of my favorites, by the way, for kids this age is a game called Too Many Monkeys. It's a really simple card game. And it's not expensive, but it's really fun. Another one is Exploding Kittens, which kids like because they feel like it's a little bit edgy, if that makes sense. But it's fun. So like if we're going to a restaurant with a couple other kids, I'll often grab Exploding Kittens or Too Many Monkeys so that they are not on their devices or they can interact with the other kids, things like that.
I love that. Yeah, I love board games. And I like how you mentioned in the anti-parenting tips that it's okay not to play with them, because I'm like that too. Like the get down on the floor and we got to play, pretend this and this. I'm not into, and I kind of felt guilty about that. But a board game, yes. So much great advice. And I think with this advice just kind of maybe puts confidence in parenting, because yes, if I'm taking them to the grocery store, which I get a little anxiety myself when I have to do that, but now I'll be confident in the choice that I made, be like, no, listen, and how it is good for them. So thank you for that, like, confidence booster.
Part of why I wanted to give those actions. So part of why I wanted to give the anti-parenting tips is really because I feel like as parents in our society right now, we are just constantly inundated with advice, some of which maybe is helpful, some of which is not helpful, but a lot of pressure. And I do think, every moment you should be nurturing your child, and know that they benefit from having those moments where they're not being nurtured and they have to figure it out. So some of this is like, hey, parents, we can all take a deep breath and relax. And, when there is a real problem, yes, address it. But a lot of the times they can work through these problems and it's okay. You know what I mean? So I'm glad you found that useful. I read a child with executive function is considered to be 2 years younger than the actual age. Do you mean ADHD? So I will just tell you. So one thing I joke is that in normal, typically developing children, executive functioning is going to be 2 or 3 years less when they are hungry or when they are tired. Okay, so it is the first thing to go. All right. I think probably we lose a couple years executive functioning when we are hungry or tired. So don't forget, okay, about that. So every kid and every human has variability in their executive functioning throughout the day. I don't make nearly as good choices at 9 o'clock at night as I do at 8 o'clock in the morning. In terms of ADHD, there is actually evidence that the brain development of the frontal lobe development is about 3 to 4 years delayed. So, or some people have said 30% less than the child's actual age. So, so if it's ADHD, yes, the executive functioning skills are going to be just developmentally delayed, but they do tend to get there, especially if they benefit from medication and supports. They will be delayed. The article spoke about ADHD and executive function, yes, and that's actually, I think, No, I don't know. That was one of the slides. So actually, and that's pretty easy to Google, is the normal brain development study in ADHD actually showing that executive functioning goes, what is happening to frontal lobe development during that time. Does that help?
This was great, Dr. Bloom. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you
Yeah, we
so
really appreciate it. And I think you had your contact info up there, but when we follow up with families, we'll definitely share your office information and contact info if they have any follow-up questions or assessment asks. So thank you again. Thank you guys, parents. It's hard to break off from the busy day, but we appreciate it very much.
Yes, and I wanted
guys
to say before we leave, I wanted to say too, if you're interested in talking more about despair and anxiety, I have a book club coming up, virtual book club just like this. Starting on March 1st, we're going to be reading this book. I'm going to send it all out with our stuff. It's called Seen, and it's Healing Despair and Anxiety in Kids and Teens Through the Power of Connection. It's a quick book, and it's going to be kind of more of like a time for us to connect, for you guys to connect with other parents that have children that are struggling with either anxiety or despair, and for us to kind of connect and discuss. So I'll put all that in the email as well. Okay. Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Juliana. I really appreciate it.
It's my
Take
pleasure.
care,
Great
everyone.
seeing everyone. See you in a few weeks.
Thank you
Bye.
so much. This is
Take
great.
care.